Thanks for tuning into No Wine in No Time. I'm your host, Dave, and today we're going to explore the fascinating world of port wines. In Portugal, where the Douro River empties into the Atlantic Ocean, lies a city with a reputation for producing the highest quality fortified wines in the entire world. And that's the city of Porto. And Porto is the second largest city in Portugal, second only to Lisbon. In this particular area, there is an extensive warehouse district where port wines are both manufactured and also aged to their beautiful perfection. So to understand exactly what is port wine, let's talk about how that wine is produced. So grapes come from the Douro River Valley, so that's upstream, and those grapes come and they are turned into wine, but they're fermented very, very lightly. What I mean by that is after the grapes are crushed, we're allowing the yeast to act upon the sugar in the wine juice for about 48 hours. At that point, we're going to go ahead and stop the fermentation. The resultant wine is a very sweet but very low alcohol wine. So to increase stability in this particular wine, the Portuguese then add a neutral grape spirit, or basically brandy, to the process. And what that does is that stabilizes the wine and gives it the ability to age virtually endlessly. Port wine is one of the first three, with Tokai and Chianti, to be sanctioned and protected by the world of wine, and it dates back to the 1600s. So we have an incredible lineage of producing wine in this particular area of Portugal. So there are 5 main grapes that are used in producing port wine, and those particular grapes are Tinto Barroca, Tinto Cao, Tinta Roriz, Touriga Francesca, and also Touriga Nacional. And of those grapes, Touriga Nacional is the most important because it creates the highest quality port of any of the 5. Now, don't feel bad if you didn't recognize the names of any of those grapes. They are very uniquely Portuguese and grow in this particular area. Let's take a look at the 3 main styles of port. And the first style is the least expensive, and that is one called Ruby Port. So Ruby Port, once again, same process. We're going to ferment the grape juice very lightly, low alcohol, high sugar. We're going to go ahead and fortify that with a neutral grape brandy and produce a Ruby Port. Now what you can expect from a Ruby Port is a deep, dark in color type of fortified wine. It is crisp, it is fruity, and when I say fruity, that's the most important component of it. People that gravitate towards Ruby Ports, as opposed to the next category that we're going to talk about in a minute, do it because they like the freshness of that particular port wine. So, category number 2, and that's one called a tawny port. And tawny port gets its name from the color. So what we're doing is we're taking a Ruby Port and we're aging it for tremendously long periods of time in oak barrels in these port lodges in Porto, Portugal. What we're doing is we're enacting a controlled oxidation on the product. We're taking those fresh, crisp, fruity flavors and turning them into more nutty and mature type of flavors over time. When we look at a true tawny port, there always will be a number on that port. 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year. That refers to the average age of the ports that were used in producing that product. So what I mean by that, let's just say we have a 20-year tawny port. There's going to be tawny ports in there 25, 30 years old. And what we're trying to do is establish the average age of the port itself. So when you add them all together, divide by, you're going to get the average age of that port itself. So tawny ports aren't for everybody, but we're going to explore one here in just a moment. And then kind of the top of the mountain is one called a vintage port. So vintage ports will resemble more of a ruby port, but they're only done in years when the vintage was absolutely perfect. So when you ask for a vintage port, you're going to spend more than you would for a ruby port when you're in your local wine store, and you won't find every single vintage. I get people that come in and ask me questions. Oh, we had a baby in fill in the blank 2008, and we would like to get a vintage port that we can celebrate when our baby turns 21. Well, in 2008, that wasn't a vintage port year, and there is no vintage port from 2008, so it makes it a little bit difficult because it's not every year. But it is to be celebrated because when there is a vintage port, it is an exceptional vintage. Let's get back and taste a tawny port. So remember, this is a ruby port that spends significant time in oak and experiences a controlled oxidation. Today, I picked you a Graham's 10-year-old tawny port. So Graham's, that sounds obviously English and not Portuguese, and that's because most of the port trade for hundreds of years has been controlled by the British. So when you see most of the names on port bottles, Dow's, Ware's, Graham's, etc., most of them are English in nature. So as long as you're not buying Taylor Port, which is a New York one, that's a whole different subject, stick with Portugal, significantly better quality. So let's go ahead and take a look at this wine. The first thing we'll notice is exactly why this gets the name tawny port. It is brown. Around the edges, it's kind of a deep, almost like a chestnut or a tawny type color. So when we think about, if we say, oh, that person has tawny colored hair, that's exactly what this gets its name from. So let's swirl to liberate some of the aromas. And just shooting out of the glass is a little bit of a candied fruit flavor. So think some of the fruits, the cherries, the pineapple, things that go into a fruit cake, candied fruit, and then also buttered nuts, almonds, walnuts, cashews, really a beautiful butterscotch stripe in the background. Tawny port is one of the most aromatic of all the fortified wines, and one that, this is kind of a 10-year tawny port, so it's a little bit more affordable than a 20 or 30, but a significantly beautiful product. So let's go ahead and take a taste. Wow. So across the palate, this particular wine enters in obviously very sweet on the front side of the palate. I get things like honey, a little bit of butterscotch and toffee. Then when it goes mid-palate, you can feel the acidity in the wine. It is extremely well balanced. And on the back side, it's all about the nuts. I get a little bit of almonds, a little bit of walnuts on the back side, and all the way through it's kind of sewn together with this almost like a creme brulee flavor. Very mature, but very beautiful and elegant. So let's talk about what's the application for a tawny port, a ruby port, or a vintage port. Well, these are what we consider to be after dinner wines. You could call them dessert wines, but certainly made for sipping in a small cordial glass at the end of a meal. You could also pair these beautifully with things like blue cheese, Roquefort, also things like dark chocolate. Port and dark chocolate is just an absolutely beautiful pairing. And the final thing I want to mention before we part is the longevity of these products. So when we think about port being a fortified wine, remember, low alcohol, sweet, then fortified with a neutral grape spirit, that does stabilize the wine. You can read in the pages of Wine Spectator, different publications, people drinking port from the 1700s, the 1800s, and describing how beautiful it is. It is a very stable product and one that can age for decades. But once we pull the cork, how long is that going to last? Remember, we talked about it being oxidized somewhat. So in the ruby or the vintage port category, once we pull the cork, that wine is good for about a week. On a tawny port like this, once we pull the cork, it should last for about a month. One final thing, how do we serve port? Do we serve it cold or do we serve it room temperature? Just want it slightly below room temperature. The absolute perfect temperature to serve a port is between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to enjoy a little bit more of this Graham's 10-year tawny port. Thanks so much for tuning in, and please come back next time, because soon you'll know wine in no time.